My sister wore a wedding dress to my wedding. Guess how that worked out? Perfect revenge takes patience, my fiancé whispered, his eyes gleaming with mischief as we sat across from my parents in their living room. The words that had just left their mouths seemed surreal. They wanted my golden child sister to wear a wedding dress and walk down the aisle at my wedding. If I hadn't spent a lifetime being their second-choice daughter, I might have thought this was a cruel joke. But looking at my sister's triumphant smirk, I knew this was just another chapter in our family's twisted dynamic. Little did they know, they had just handed us the perfect opportunity for payback. I need to explain the years of systematic favoritism that led to this moment. Growing up as the younger sister in our household wasn't just about being second, it was about being systematically erased. Every memory I have is tainted by the shadow of my sister's perceived perfection. When we were young, my birthday celebrations became about her preferences. My cake had to be her favorite flavor because everyone likes chocolate better than vanilla anyway. My parents would conveniently forget that I hated chocolate every single year, despite my quiet protests. The inequality went far deeper than just birthday cakes. If my sister accused me of anything, I was guilty before I could even open my mouth to defend myself. Even with concrete evidence proving my innocence, my parents would find a way to punish me while giving her nothing more than a gentle reminder about honesty. It was as if they had two completely different parenting manuals, one filled with understanding and forgiveness for her, and another filled with suspicion and harsh consequences for me. I still remember the day I scored higher than her on a math test in middle school. Instead of celebration, I received an accusation of cheating. When the teacher confirmed my score was legitimate, my parents switched tactics. Suddenly, my success became a tool to motivate my sister. See how well you could do if you just applied yourself like your sister? They never congratulated me. That night, my sister destroyed my favorite sweater in retaliation. When I showed my mother the evidence, scissors still hidden under my sister's bed, I was punished for trying to get my sister in trouble. The social isolation started in our early teens. My sister's friend group gradually disappeared. Whether they moved away or finally tired of her entitled behavior, I'll never know. My parents never discussed her social struggles, though they loved broadcasting her every minor achievement to anyone who would listen. But her sudden loneliness turned her occasional meanness into a focused campaign of destruction aimed squarely at me. She couldn't stand that I had friends while she had none. The accusations began. I was stealing her potential friends. I was spreading rumors about her. I was trying to make her look bad. My parents, ever ready to believe the worst of me, began restricting my social activities. Their excuses ranged from, "These friends are a bad influence," to, "Why can't you be more like your sister and enjoy family time?" The isolation would have been complete if not for my extended family, particularly my cousins, who saw through the facade. One family gathering changed everything, though not immediately. When my cousins invited me to an event and I explained I couldn't go because I wasn't allowed to have friends since my sister didn't have any, the adults' reactions told me something was wrong. I was punished for lying and grounded for a month, but afterward my parents loosened their restrictions slightly. My sister changed schools, presumably because the humiliation of having her social status exposed to the extended family was too much to bear, but the damage was done. Instead of returning to merely ignoring me, my sister's behavior escalated. When her new school friends came over, they would join in bullying me while my parents dismissed it as teenage teasing. I stopped inviting friends over entirely. The combination of my parents' hostile hosting and my sister's habit of accusing them of theft made it impossible to maintain friendships in our home. The boyfriend situations were particularly painful. My first serious relationship ended because of my sister's machinations. She showed up in revealing clothing, attempted to flirt with him, and when he rejected her advances, she told our parents he had tried to seduce her. They believed her without question, despite the fact that this scenario would repeat itself with my next boyfriend. Their solution? I clearly had bad judgment in men and needed stricter oversight. Let me paint a clearer picture of our family dynamics through appearance. Something I hadn't wanted to mention, but becomes relevant to understanding just how delusional some situations were. My parents were overweight, and their way of showing love often involved food. More food, more treats, more everything. Naturally, my sister, being the recipient of their endless affection, inherited both their build and their relationship with food. I, on the other hand, remained skinny, partly because one of their favorite punishments was withholding snacks and treats from me. This physical difference became another weapon in my sister's arsenal. She would often accuse my boyfriends of flirting with her, despite the fact that her attempts at seduction were both obvious and uncomfortable. I'm not being cruel here. I'm setting the stage for why even my teenage self, riddled with self-doubt from years of gaslighting, couldn't believe her accusations. Her flirting attempts were painfully awkward, born from someone who never had to develop social skills because everything was handed to her. The college years marked a pivotal change in our family dynamic. My sister was accepted into a mediocre college. No scholarships, just acceptance. Our parents celebrated like she'd gotten into Harvard. They promised to pay for everything: tuition, housing, books, spending money. Meanwhile, I maintained excellent grades throughout high school, partly because I was rarely allowed to go anywhere or do anything else. Then came the conversation that would change everything. My mother sat me down for what she probably thought was a reasonable discussion about my future. Since they were paying for my sister's college education, they claimed they couldn't afford mine. Their solution? I should start working immediately after graduation and wait until my sister finished college to see if they could afford something for me. But here's the kicker. They didn't just want me to wait. If I stayed at home, I would need to pay rent, bills, and my own expenses. When I mentioned student loans, my mother's response was particularly rich. According to her, they cared too much about me to let me make such important financial decisions on my own, given my history of poor judgment. They would decide if any college was worth me going into debt for. Who? What they didn't know was that I had been preparing for this moment for years. All those nights stuck at home while my sister went out? I spent them studying. All those weekends when I couldn't see friends? I was working on scholarship applications. Their attempts to control me had inadvertently given me the time and motivation to secure my escape route. When I announced that I had received a full scholarship to a respected college, their reactions were priceless. Initial pride quickly turned to concern when my sister expressed her displeasure. Suddenly, they were questioning whether I could handle college, using my sister's struggling grades as evidence that I, being less capable, would surely fail. College became my sanctuary. For the first time in my life, I experienced what it felt like to be judged on my own merits rather than in comparison to my sister. I flourished academically and socially, though I kept my romantic life carefully separated from my family. During this time, my sister dropped out of college, a fact I learned about only through the grapevine, as any family news that didn't paint her in a glowing light was carefully hidden from discussion. She moved back home, paying no rent or bills, unlike what they had planned for me, and secured a job at my mother's company through pure nepotism. This was presented to me as evidence of her superior business acumen and networking skills. The irony was lost on them. Quote, "Then I met the man who would become my husband. From the moment he entered my life, everything changed. He was different from anyone I had ever met. The perfect combination of strategic thinking and righteous indignation on my behalf. While I was the type to think of the perfect comeback hours later while lying awake at night, he was the kind of person who could deliver devastating responses in real time. My husband understood toxic family dynamics in a way few others did. While most people would sympathetically murmur, "That must be hard," when hearing about my family, he would get this gleam in his eye and start plotting. He was the type of person who didn't just get mad, he got even, but always in ways that left him looking completely innocent. When we decided to get married, our initial plan was simple: a courthouse wedding followed by our dream honeymoon in Europe. We weren't particularly interested in a big ceremony, preferring to invest our money in experiences rather than a single day's celebration. But fate and my family's predictable behavior had other plans. Since most of our families lived in my hometown, we decided to hold the ceremony there. We sent out engagement announcements and saved the dates, initiating what would become the most elaborate revenge plot of our lives. My parents, predictably, demanded to meet my fiancé. I was hesitant, years of experience making me wary of any family interaction, but my husband was practically bouncing with excitement. "Trust me," he said, pulling out a high-quality voice recorder. "I've been waiting for this moment." He had already anticipated my sister's typical behavior pattern and was prepared to document everything. What we didn't expect was just how far my parents would go. Instead of my sister's usual flirting attempts, my parents and sister orchestrated something far more audacious. They sat my fiancé down and made their proposal. They would pay for our wedding, but only if my sister could walk down the aisle first, wearing a wedding dress, complete with photos and her own cake. Their justification? It wasn't proper for a younger sister to marry first, so this would make things fair. When my husband returned from this meeting, he was practically glowing with excitement. "Babe," he said, "you won't believe what they just handed us." He made me listen to his explanation before playing the recording, worried I might misinterpret their words in my anger. But as he laid out their proposal, a plan began forming in both our minds. Quote, "What followed were months of the most intricate deception I've ever been part of. My husband played the role of conspirator perfectly, telling my parents he thought he could convince me to accept their help if we surprised me with everything on the wedding day. He claimed that, knowing my conflict-avoidant nature, I wouldn't make a scene in front of guests. To really sell it, he painted me as controlling and paranoid, claiming I checked his phone regularly due to trust issues from past relationships. This explanation served two purposes. It explained why all communications about their plan had to be in person, and it played into their existing narrative about my poor judgment with men. The genius of our plan lay in how we manipulated their manipulations. Every time we selected a budget option for the wedding, my husband would secretly take my sister to sample the more expensive choices. He would sigh dramatically about how we couldn't abuse my parents' generosity, which inevitably led to my sister demanding, and my parents paying for, the most expensive options. This pattern repeated with every wedding detail. For the flowers, we chose simple arrangements. Then my husband showed my sister elaborate bouquets of exotic blooms. For the photographer, we selected a basic package until my sister saw the premium offerings. The catering, the venue decorations, the music, everything followed the same pattern. My parents, eager to ensure their plan would succeed, kept upgrading everything to my sister's expensive tastes. We hit a minor snag with the wedding dress. My mother tried to force me into a particular dress that wasn't my style. Actually, it was downright unflattering. Originally, we planned to agree and then simply not use it, but my mother made the mistake of sending a text about it. This created a paper trail we couldn't risk. I had to refuse via text, standing my ground about wanting a different dress. My husband smoothed things over by visiting them, pretending he'd try to convince me. That's when my sister suggested sabotaging my preferred dress to force me into their choice. My husband pretended to agree, later bringing them some leftover fabric from my dress alterations as proof of the sabotage. He claimed he needed to rush back to calm me down, as I was hysterical about the damaged dress. During all these months of planning, my sister did make several attempts to flirt with my husband. He played these moments perfectly, acting conflicted and uncomfortable but never outright rejecting her. This added credibility to his role as someone who might be convinced to go along with their scheme. My sister, used to getting her way through manipulation, never suspected she was being played at her own game. We arranged for security at the venue, but kept them hidden initially. The day of the wedding, all guests could see was a woman with a guest list checking names. Only after my parents arrived and were seated did we position our more intimidating security guard, with clear instructions about not letting my sister enter, and the promise of a generous tip for his troubles. The timing was crucial. My parents received a text that my sister was 5 minutes away, exactly as planned. My dad immediately started directing the bridesmaids to begin the procession, without checking with me, exactly as we anticipated. After the bridesmaids took their places, my dad positioned himself at the entrance, clearly expecting my sister, not me. One of my husband's friends, who was in on the plan but not in the wedding party, had been tasked with texting me the signal. We couldn't risk having any of the wedding party checking their phones, as it might tip off our guests that something was coordinated. When she confirmed everything was in position, I made my entrance. The look on my dad's face was priceless. He seemed genuinely shocked to see me there, as if it hadn't occurred to him that I might actually show up to my own wedding. When his phone rang with my sister's number, he just left. Right there, in front of everyone, he abandoned his youngest daughter at the altar to answer his golden child's call. The gasps from our guests were audible when my father walked away. I stood there fighting back very real tears, not from sadness but from the shocking confirmation that my father would actually abandon me at my own wedding. Even after years of being second best, some small part of me had hoped he wouldn't go this far. Our friend in on the plan, seeing my genuine distress, executed her role perfectly. She loudly asked what my father had meant by saying, "It wasn't supposed to be me." The whispers started immediately. She then announced she would go check what was happening, ensuring she'd create maximum chaos at the confrontation with security. My mother left shortly after, unable to resist the drama unfolding outside. Through all of this, my husband's father, who we'd briefed about possibly needing to step in, rushed to my side. Watching this man, who had shown me more fatherly love in a few years than my own father had in a lifetime, sprint down the aisle to ensure I wouldn't stand alone, brought the first genuine smile to my face. The ceremony itself went perfectly. My husband kept whispering little jokes about my Oscar-worthy sad face and promising to rake them over the coals for what they'd done. Meanwhile, outside, an entirely different scene was unfolding. According to the detailed reports we received afterward, my sister had arrived in a full wedding dress, expecting to make her grand entrance. When the security guard refused to let her in, stating there was already a bride inside, she began throwing a tantrum that would have embarrassed a toddler. My father tried threatening the security guard with police action, claiming he'd never heard of him. The guard, well briefed and generously compensated, calmly agreed to wait for police, knowing it would be too late by then. This only escalated my sister's meltdown. Witnesses described her literally sitting on the ground, kicking and screaming like a child who'd been denied candy. My mother's arrival only added to the chaos, as she tried to simultaneously manage my sister's tantrum and threaten the security guard. The real entertainment began when other guests, hearing the commotion, went to investigate. My parents and sister, realizing their plan was falling apart, tried to do damage control by claiming my husband had been in on it all along. This backfired spectacularly when my husband was called outside. His performance was masterful. Looking completely confused, he denied everything in this. When they insisted he had agreed to their plan, he demanded proof, which of course, they couldn't provide. Every text message they could show only contained normal wedding planning details. Their claim that he had instructed them not to put anything in writing only made them look more ridiculous. My husband's denial was a masterclass in acting. "How convenient," he said loudly, "that there's absolutely no proof of this ridiculous plan you're claiming I agreed to." He then launched into a blistering speech about their terrible parenting that had every witness nodding in agreement. By this point, my sister was in full meltdown mode, her makeup streaking down her face as she screamed incoherently about how unfair everything was. Several guests had their phones out, recording the spectacle. Though the venue's security cameras caught everything, they later refused to share the footage, stating it was for security purposes only. The crowd that had gathered was merciless in their judgment. Years of watching my parents favor my sister, years of them believing her lies about me, all came to a head as relatives and friends tore into them. Every attempt they made to defend themselves only dug them deeper. Why would a groom agree to such a preposterous plan? Why was there no proof? Why would they want to ruin their daughter's wedding day? Eventually, they were told to leave. My sister had to be physically dragged up from the ground by my father as she refused to stop her tantrum. The contrast between their humiliating exit and the joyous celebration that followed couldn't have been more stark. Inside the reception, our guests were incredible. No one mentioned the drama to me directly. I suppose they wanted to protect the bride. But everyone went above and beyond to make the day special. My husband says the expensive food and drinks we'd manipulated my parents into paying for certainly helped the festive mood. Quote, "The aftermath was everything we could have hoped for. My parents tried calling repeatedly, but following my husband's advice, I only responded to written communications to maintain a paper trail. When my sister finally sent a message, it was an unhinged rant that accomplished everything we'd hoped for. She called my husband a two-faced snake," he wants to frame that particular, and claimed he'd fooled them for months, inadvertently admitting they'd been planning this disruption all along. She swung wildly between accusing him of cheating on me with her and hoping he would cheat on me in the future. The cognitive dissonance was impressive. My brilliant husband took screenshots of everything: the call logs, my sister's message, my parents' demanding texts, and sent them all to our family group chat. He then wrote a masterfully crafted message expressing concern about their harassment, begging family members to help stop them from ruining our honeymoon as they'd tried to ruin our wedding. He even added a pointed request not to share our location, to prevent my sister from showing up and claiming I'd somehow agreed to meet her in our honeymoon suite. The extended family's response was swift and absolute. They promised to handle the situation, and since then we've had blessed silence. My husband is slightly disappointed. My sister hasn't tried to contact us again. He had more schemes ready if she did. Looking back, people often ask me how my family came to treat me this way. After a lifetime of wondering, I've developed a theory. I was an unplanned pregnancy, coming too soon after my sister's miracle birth. My parents weren't well off, and suddenly having two babies instead of their planned one likely created resentment. But honestly, the reason doesn't matter anymore. No explanation could justify their treatment of me. Some have also questioned whether they really thought their plan would work. My husband and I have discussed this at length, and we believe they never actually wanted to go through with it. We think my sister threw a tantrum about me getting married first, and they made this outrageous proposal expecting us to refuse. That way, they could look good to my sister while having an excuse not to contribute to my wedding. When my husband accepted, they were trapped by their own scheme. As I write this from our honeymoon resort, watching my husband gleefully reread my sister's angry messages for the 100th time, I feel nothing but satisfaction. The expensive wedding they paid for, the public exposure of their behavior, the family finally seeing them for what they are. It's better than any revenge I could have dreamed up on my own. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't just about getting even. It's about letting toxic people destroy themselves while you watch from a safe distance, preferably with a champagne cocktail in hand. And if that revenge happens to be all expenses paid by the very people you're getting revenge against, well, that's just the icing on my perfectly selected, definitely not chocolate wedding cake.